Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel by Maren Schmidt, Shannon Schmidt, Maddie Scott, and Reynolds Seaton. Jared Diamond was born and raised in Boston. His father was a pediatrician, and his mother was a concert pianist. Born in 1937, he grew up during World War II. He was therefore influenced by World War II. He had a second-hand experience with the war and saw it all through the maps on his bedroom wall. He had a map of the Pacific and a map of Europe that his father would move pins on to show the ships and battle lines. He grew up with history and geography staring him in the face. Jared attended Roxbury Latin School and there discovered his love for language and history. By his 60s, he knew 12 languages. He assumed he would be a doctor like his father, so he took minimal science courses because he figured he would be doing science for the rest of his life. He attended Harvard College and took minimal science courses once more. He then got a PhD at Cambridge instead of going to medical school. Post-graduation, he lived and traveled in Europe for 4 years while getting his Cambridge doctorate. He traveled all over the world, exploring the world post-World War II. He returned to the United States in 1962 and pursued a career in laboratory physiological research. He realized he would have to focus on one small part of the human body for the rest of his life, one small area of the medical world, which he didn't like. He found it stimulating to pursue multiple interests at once. In 1964, Jared took a summer trip to New Guinea. It was a complete eye-opener for him. This is a quote based on his studies there from Jared Diamond. New Guineans were then known as primitive people, meaning that they traditionally didn't have metal tools, but just stone tools. They didn't have writing, they didn't have kings or chiefs, and they had little in the way of clothing. That led me, naively, to expect them to be primitive in other ways as well. But I soon found out that they were instead very smart people. Why then didn't they have writing or steel tools, when I, the dope, who couldn't find his way or light a fire in the jungle, did have writing and steel tools? That was a question that stayed in my mind for a long time after my 1964 trip, and it finally resulted in my 1997 book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, to answer that question. New Guinea solved his career problem. He then developed 3 careers, one in laboratory physiology, one in evolutionary biology of New Guinea birds, and one in writing. He grew more interested over time in people and history, and less in molecules and molecular physiology. Jared completed his career switch at age 65 when he ended his career in laboratory science and moved to 2 careers, one in geography and comparative environmental history, and one in evolutionary biology.
Jared Diamond's main argument was that the West is more economically successful than the rest of the world because of geography. He believed it had a bigger influence than beliefs and government. His factors were shape and location of continents, flora and fauna, microbes, water, the access and the amount of clean water available, climate, topography, available resources, plant and animal species. He states that geography impacts the content of history, conquest, politics, and technology. His approach is similar to Darwinism because some geographic regions are more fit than others. The east to west axis of Europe was more beneficial than north to south axis of Africa and America. Eurasia had good geography because they had great biotic diversity that allowed plant and animal domestication to develop more easily. Plants and animals move easier from east to west because it's a similar climate on that plane, rather than north and south that have different climates. This also allowed agriculture and other developments to spread easier. He wants to show the power of geography by shaping human social organization. Another argument is violence and conquest. He believes that violence is something that everyone has in their life and goes through it. He doesn't exactly explain how geography impacts violence in his book, but he gives the example of Pizarro's conquest of the Incas without any Spanish casualties. Spanish conquistadors had advantages in a military contest. So another argument is material factors, food production and the biology of immunity. Geography impacts the materialistic factors, and the impact on culture is a factor with casualties in societies. His example was Eurasian people being immune to infection because of their exposure to domesticated animals, which is tied to geography, giving these people an advantage. He states that race has no significant impact on features. Europeans had the benefits of immunity to disease, advanced technology of writing and navigation, and weapons because of their intelligence, not because of their race, but their location.
Now we're going to take a look at how Diamond's theory is applicable in history. Clear examples of Diamond's theory can be found with the colonization of Latin America by the Spanish in the 1500s. We see two Spanish explorers, Cortés and Pizarro, invade this territory and come out victorious due to European advantages stemming from geography. Cortés's landfall on the area that is modern-day Mexico marks the first European encounter with an organized nation-state. This was in 1519. This is the birth of Spanish colonization and the idea of the conquistador. There were cultural differences between the Spanish invaders and the Aztec natives that gave the Spanish a huge advantage. The most prominent example of this is the differing fighting tactics and military practices between the two groups. The Aztec people sought hand-to-hand combat and had a high regard for honor in their warriors. On the other hand, the Spanish used cannons and guerrilla warfare tactics to avoid one-on-one combat and fight from afar. They valued strategy over brute force. This shows both a cultural difference as well as advanced technology, or the idea of guns, that plays into Diamond's theory. The Spanish portrayed the Aztec people as uncivilized and less advanced in written accounts sent back to the mother country, and the idea of colonization for the benefit of less developed civilizations was formed. This allowed colonizers to feel benevolent to the populations that they oppressed and conquered. In both the Aztec and Inca populations, disease played a devastating role in the subjugation of their people. With Pizarro and the conquering of the Inca people, the arrival of the Spanish meant the introduction of deadly diseases that Incan immune systems were not equipped to handle. It's estimated that over the span of 10 years, between 50 and 90% of the population was afflicted by influenza and smallpox. This effectively weakened the working class, which resulted in less agricultural output. The deadly diseases in their aftermath took a huge toll on the Incan population and allowed for the Spanish to easily gain control of the region. Another way to see how geography influences history is to compare Great Britain with Japan. Both are island nations that have very different outcomes in history. There's been 5 successful invasions of Great Britain in recorded history and no successful attempts in Japan. When looking at geographical factors for this, Britain is closely surrounded by a multitude of countries in mainland Europe with only the narrow English Channel as a buffer, whereas Japan remains relatively isolated from the rest of Asia. The two countries also practiced different trade policies for much of history, with Britain beginning to engage in international trade much earlier than Japan. While both countries are economically successful today, they had very different development trajectories that were, in part, influenced by their geography. This goes to show that there are many differing ways to achieve success.
Although Jared Diamond had many important arguments, there are still many different counter-arguments people have proposed. One of Jared Diamond's arguments includes, we ourselves are the only ones who created our new lifestyles, so it's completely in our power to change them. So he's explaining how people in more modernized areas created new ways of life, in contrast to the ways people lived in smaller, less advanced societies. So he's kind of going into detail here, talking about how people have lived different lifestyles, and since they form these lifestyles, they can change them as well. So basically, some people argue against that because developed societies and also people in lower economic classes, they face barriers daily of not being able to change their ways of life. And Diamond also argues how he uses the past experiences and interactions of humans to investigate like the environmental problems that he proposes. And although like his arguments are true, different scientific findings are needed and are necessary in order to qualify the basis of his argument. So he uses a lot of his arguments based on past experiences of people and how they interact with others. Even though those are true, more statistics, more evidence, more science will be needed behind that to back all those arguments that he has proposed.